In today's tutorial, I'm going to be making a statement bowl that looks like it's made out of rose quartz, but it's really resin. So what you're going to need is 2 different size silicone molds. So I'm going with a circular shape, and I've got one big and one smaller, and you can pick whatever size that you want depending on how big you want your bowl to be. And I'm also going to be using this casting resin from Icoat epoxy. It's an American brand, but I've heard really good things about it, so I thought I'd give it a test out, and I finally found a supplier that stocks it in Australia. Now the first color that I'm mixing up is going to be this pink. This one is from Just Resin, and I think it's like called their Dusty Pink, and I've used the smallest amount because it is a really strong opaque color, but if I use just a really tiny amount, it will make it go semi-opaque, slightly translucent, which is what I'm after for this realistic rose quartz look. And then I've just added a tiny amount of white in that, just so that way it's a little bit lighter and softer. And then I'm also going to be mixing up a pearlized white just to add a really soft sparkle through the piece, but I don't want it to be overly shiny. And then a really standard white from, I think it's from Casting Craft, which is going to be a semi-opaque, so I've only added a few drops in. And then I'm also going to be mixing up a sandy sort of beige color to go with this piece. And then once all my resin colors have been mixed up, I'm going to pop them into a vacuum chamber just to pop any bubbles before I do pour them out. This one is from Resiners, and they did send it to me, so I've been testing that out to see if I do like it. And so far I found I have been using it quite a lot for smaller batches of resin. I do have a professional vacuum chamber that I use a lot, but I find when I'm doing smaller batches of resin, I am tending to lean towards this one just because it is so easy to use. So far I am liking it. When my resin is ready and bubble free, I'm going to start off by pouring down my pink resin first, and you can see that it is really light and quite translucent, even though I did use an opaque color, just because I went with a really small amount and diluted it down with a lot of resin. And then I'm adding all of the other colors into one cup and just doing a little bit of a dirty pour just to get started. And I'm just pouring that into sort of 2 sort of squiggly lines. I'm trying to keep this really random so it will look more organic and not overdo it. And then on the top of that, I'm going to get my white resin and use my paddle pop stick to start drawing that through the resin. And I'm going to try to do this so it will look a little bit like the fractured lines that you see a lot through rose quartz and a lot of different types of stone. So I'm just going to keep using my paddle pop stick, go back and forth and really drag that through until I'm kind of happy with how the design is looking. And then on my smaller circle mold, I'm going to do the exact same thing. So putting the pink resin down first, then doing a mini dirty pour with all of the colors, and then adding that white line work on top. Now I'm only filling it up about 1 centimeter deep for both. I don't want it to be too deep because then it will be hard to sort of shape. But I also don't want it to be too thin because then there's the chance of it breaking when I do shape the resin. So it's a really fine line when working with this about how thick you should make it. My top tip when it does come to shaping resin, try to do it when it has just cured and not fully hardened. Now this will depend on the temperature of your room and the type of casting resin that you're using, so times may vary, but because it's really hot here, it only took about 8 hours before I could demold these pieces. You can see that they have cured, but they aren't hard. There's still flexibility to the pieces, which is going to make my life a lot easier when it comes to shaping them. I'm also super happy with how these have turned out. They're slightly translucent and they've got such beautiful sort of white fractured lines going through them. I think they look pretty realistic to rose quartz. Then you're going to need 2 bowls, so one big bowl for your bigger piece and one small bowl for your smaller piece. You can see here, because this is still quite soft, I'm able to just gently push it down into my bowl, which makes life a lot easier. It's also important because this is going to be on the bottom of my bowl as like a little stand holding it up, that I think about which side I want facing up. So I flipped this over because how I'm looking at it now is not going to be visible. I want to see the other side. I'm also just placing a glass jar just for a little bit of weight to make sure that it stays down and it doesn't sort of naturally push itself back up. So that way, as it does harden, it's going to harden into that shape. Now with this one, it was a little bit more hardened and it wasn't as flexible, but these are a few tips that you can do to sort of soften that back down so you can still shape it. So if you did forget to pull it out in time, you've left it too long, you can always just use a little bit of heat to soften that. But how pretty does this look already? Just seeing that top, I feel like it looks so much like rose quartz. So I'm just using my heat gun on a lower heat setting and I'm just adding that all over. I don't want to make it like crazy hot, but just warm enough that that resin will start to come flexible again. So I'm going over it, I'm checking it, I'm gently pushing it down just to see if it's ready for me to kind of really push it into place. Another way you can do this is by using hot water. So I've just added a little bit of weight into the center and then I've poured hot water over the top of that. The hot water will soften the resin the same way a heat gun does it, and that weight will start to push it down into the center, giving me a bowl shape. I also just used a leveler just to check that my bowl wasn't going to be lopsided and whether I needed to adjust anything, push a little bit more on one side, so that way it's nice and even when it does pop out. I let that fully harden from there, so I just left it for 2 days, and because I use metal bowls, they just popped out so easily. So my smaller bowl is going to be upside down and then my bigger bowl is going to be placed on top and stacked like this. But before I can attach them, I just need to do a little bit of on the bottom of my large bowl, right in the center. I am going to be using my orbital sander, and I think this is on a 400 grit, and I'm just going to be sanding that a bit flat. One, to make sure that it is completely even and level. It will be quite hard to make sure you have it 100% even and level, but this does help. And then I'm also going to be doing the same with my smaller bowl, so that way, one, when I do attach them, the resin is going to grip because it's sanded back in that area, and also two, it's going to be nice and flat, so they should sit quite flat on top of each other. And then I'm just checking that again with a leveler just to make sure I get it as level as possible. The edges of my bowl were a little bit sharp, so I don't want to be cutting my hands on this bowl. So I'm using a deburring tool, which you can get from most hardware stores, to go along and take that sharpness off the edge. Alternatively, if you do have a Dremel, you can also use a Dremel to do this. With my Dremel, I've added the sanding attachment, and I think this is a 260 grit sanding attachment, and I've just set it to number 2, so a really low speed. I don't want it to be too strong because all I'm trying to do is just take that sharp edge off. To finish off my edge, I'm using a little bit of this polishing compound. You can use any resin polish that you prefer, and I've switched the attachment on my Dremel to this small polishing attachment. Then just going along and polishing up all the areas where I did take that sharp edge off. You can do this by hand, but I'm just using a Dremel because it's a lot faster. The last step that I'm going to be doing to create my rose quartz statement bowl is to attach the two pieces together, so my base and my bowl. To do this, I've placed my base down and then I've mixed up some art resin. I've let that sit for a bit so it would get a lot thicker, so that way when I do add the top on, it's not going to slip and slide around too much as it would if it was freshly mixed up. I do think it would have been a lot easier if I did this in reverse and placed the big bowl upside down and then added the small bowl on top, just so that way I could see the center a lot easier, because obviously with the big bowl like this, I couldn't see the bottom and I couldn't tell if it was quite center. It took me quite a while to make sure it was perfect. And once the resin that was attaching the two pieces has fully cured, you have a rose quartz statement bowl. I think this turned out so beautiful. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below.